here already, let me know. I will be keeping an eye on the Twitch chat as well as on the chat on Chess24. My name is Fiona and today we are here for another lesson, and today we are gonna learn from the one and only Magnus Carlsen, the reigning world champion, and some might say maybe the strongest player of all time. Still a lot of time to go for Magnus. He's still in his prime, but today we're gonna learn from Magnus. I know you guys have already had lessons learning from Anand and from Kramnik, but today we're gonna look at Magnus. And actually I have chosen a game, since this is part of the World Online Chess Tournament. I thought, since you guys are around that age, I found a game from Magnus that he played when he was only 12 years old. So he was 12 going on 13, and it's a game taken from the World Under 14 Championship, and a game that he was playing against Andre Diamant from Brazil. Andre also went on to become a Grandmaster. He was 2 times Brazilian champion, but at the time there was already quite a big rating gap between the Magnus Carlsen. Not only is he the strongest player today, but he was already incredibly strong at a young age. The time when we're looking at this game, he was 12 years old, but he already had a rating of 2,450, so pretty impressive rating. And actually I picked this game because I think it very well highlights some of the basic principles, and also because Magnus played an opening in this game that I played myself when I was starting to play chess. So let's have a look. We start with e4, e5, which I guess is the most commonly played opening at, beginner level. Sort of what I think you should start out with if you're just learning to play chess, because you put a pawn to the center. So I think the 2 main moves at beginner level is e4 and d4, the 2 pawn pushes in the center. This game, these days, Magnus is of course very versatile. He can play pretty much anything, but this game he opened with e5 and Andre responded with, he opened with e4 and Andre responded with e5. I see some people in the chat. It's good to see you all. And yeah, so let's continue with the game. Magnus plays knight f3 once again, the most played move. You develop a piece and you look at the center. So the knight is looking at the pawn on e5 and also looking at d4, a central square. Black responds with the most played so far. Everything is normal. I think basically also something else I like about this game, the reason I chose it, is because in the beginning we will see a lot of very basic principles, and as the game continues, it sort of gets a bit more advanced, but hopefully there will be something to learn for everybody here. And now Magnus, here there is a wide variety of moves. You can play bishop c4, which some of you might know, it's the Italian game. You can play bishop b5, probably the most played move at the highest level. It's the Ruy Lopez or the Spanish. But Magnus chose d4, a move which is also, I would say those are the 3 main moves, and this is called, I don't know if some of you know it, but this is called the Scotch Opening. In the Scotch Opening, I'm sure some of you who are watching play it yourself, and it's also the opening that I played when I started playing chess. What I like about the Scotch is that you immediately fight for the center. You push your pawn to d4, you attack the pawn on e5, and you immediately say, okay, I want to fight for the center. So black captures that pawn and white recaptures with the knight. And now we see a somewhat rare move by black here. Black played g6. So this will be my first question to you. What are the other moves that you would consider playing here as black? Because g6 doesn't necessarily do the things that I was talking about, so in the opening, I think the main principles in the opening are controlling the center, developing your pieces, And also we'll talk more about that in a second, but the notion of grabbing space, taking as much space as you can, and then in the next step to put your king into safety, which is also very important. So can somebody tell me what are other moves that you would consider here as black? Absolutely, so Matt gets it. That is, once again, I've played this opening with both colors and the move suggested in the chat. A simple development move like bishop c5. Bishop c5 is one of the two main moves here. It does two things. It develops another piece and it attacks the knight on d4, and also that is one of the dream diagonals for this bishop. So absolutely bishop c5, one of the main moves. And the other one does pretty much the same thing. It is also a developing move. It is knight to f6. So you develop another piece. What you want to do is you want to get out those two pieces, the knight from g8 and the bishop from f8, so that you can then put your king to safety by castling. So those are the two main moves, but Andrej chose somewhat more rare line, g6, indicating that he wants to develop his bishop to g7, what we call the fianchetto. And now Magnus here plays a move once again. It is quite advanced for that level. There's some more options. Of course, developing all the pieces would make sense, but I like Magnus's move. Magnus goes for c4 here. So c4 is another central pawn push, but what white does, he fights for the center. So he pushes yet another pawn, but he will be able to develop his pieces behind his pawns, and he is fighting for this square here on d5. So I really like that move by Magnus, fighting for the control over the center and gaining space, which we will talk about more in a second. Black continues with his development, knight f6, the move we just talked about, and white is now able to develop his piece knight c3, defending this pawn here, which was attacked. Black plays d6, and now we see one of the reasons why white had played c4, and c4 stopped the d5 pawn push. So black is only able to push his pawn one square, only to d6. In an ideal world, he would like to fight for the center himself with the pawn push to d5, but since white stopped it, he can only push it one square. And now we see an interesting move from Magnus, knight c2. I was just talking about fighting for the center, and we thought the knight actually looked nice and centrally placed on d4. So can somebody tell me what the idea is behind moving the knight back to c2? So why would you want to do that? And absolutely, Matt is making a good point. I should have mentioned it. It is a bit advanced, but this structure that white chose with the pawns on c4 and e4 is called the Maroczy bind. So for those of you who know this, very well done to you. It's quite an advanced concept, but well done if you're already familiar with the Maroczy bind. So, what could be the idea behind the move knight c2? Because as I said, the knight was well placed, but the knight could have been exchanged against the black knight. So white said, no, I don't want to exchange my pieces, I will drop my knight back. And why would you do that? Why do you think Magnus decided to keep more pieces on the board? So Cor is saying knight e3. So knight e3 is one idea, but I'm looking for a more general answer as to why, not just for this position in particular, but why in this situation, when you have more space, why would you be more keen to keep the pieces on the board? So okay, I'll wait another second. But basically the reason, and this is again, it's quite an advanced concept, but the idea is that if you are the side that has more space, you want to, it's easier for you. Your opponent has less space, so he would be happy to swap off the pieces so that the pieces can breathe easier. You can basically think of it almost as a house. If you have a bigger house with more people, exactly. So the side that is cramped wants to exchange the pieces to get more space for the remaining pieces. While for white, he is happy to keep more pieces on the board, and he can then sort of dance around with his pieces, which is a lot easier when you have more space. So black now completes his development. He fianchettos the bishop to g7, also a nice diagonal for the bishop. White put his bishop to e2, and now both sides castle. So I think both sides here have respected all the opening principles. They have developed their pieces. We still have the queen side is left to be developed, this bishop and this rook, same on the right side. But both players have, gotten out all their pieces from the king side. They have tucked their king into safety by castling. And I would say here is, in my opinion, the end of the opening phase. So the opening is completed. And if we have a look at the position here, I think nothing dramatic has happened yet. Both players have played very normal moves. But I already like Magnus's position here. Magnus has more space in the center. He has those two pawns on e4 and c4. And I just feel he has a little bit more control over the position, more control over the center, and more space. Okay, so black, he decides that this knight here, black now does another. We saw one knight maneuver by white when Magnus dropped the knight back to c2, but now it's black's turn to start doing some maneuvering. You might think this is a strange move because the knight goes backwards and it blockades the bishop from c8, which is still not developed. But what's the idea here? Why did black move this knight again and move it backwards? This very similar to the maneuver we just saw from the white side, but I'll see if someone can answer it in the chat. So the idea is basically the same, not the same as we saw before, but if we look at the knight, before the knight hopped to d7, the knight was here on f6, and it didn't really have many prospects. It was of course looking at this pawn on e4, but that pawn is well defended by the knight, and it's hard to increase the pressure. It couldn't hop to g4 or to h5, all those squares are covered. So basically what the knight wants to do, the knight wants to find a new home, but to do so it maneuvers to d7, because from d7 suddenly the knight is looking at the squares on c5 and on e5, both of which would be nice, what we call outposts in chess. So those would be two nice squares that the knight is hoping to jump to. So now white plays bishop d2, and bishop d2 has a few ideas behind it. So the main idea, well, first of all, white develops his last bishop. That was the last minor piece that wasn't defended yet, so he puts that to d2, but also he defends the knight on c3. We will see actually on the next move, I'll come back to this, after knight c5, white pushed with d4, with b4, and in order to do that he had to first defend the knight on c3. But another idea is, let's say white, instead of playing bishop d2, had played a random move like h3. Black could consider, it's not necessarily the best move, but black could consider to take on c3, and then you would end up with what we call double pawns here on the c file. And not only double pawns, but they are doubled and isolated. Isolated means that they don't have any pawns on the files next to them that can defend them. So it means they are isolated and doubled, which is usually the worst kind of pawn. So that's one more idea behind bishop d2, is if you are not sure that you want to allow these pawns, best to defend the knight with the bishop, so that now if black takes, of course you would recapture with the bishop. So after bishop d2 we saw the next move already. Black continues jumping around with the knight and he goes to c5. So now he's again looking down at this pawn, but we see that here the knight is already more active than it was on f6, and also now that it's gone from f6, this bishop is nice and open looking down at this diagonal. So I already showed you the next move. Magnus now plays b4, and I really like this move. Once again, a few purposes, a few reasons behind why you want to play b4. First of all, you are kicking out this knight, which just came to c5. I said c5 is a nice square for the knight, so first of all we kick it out from there, but also, once again, we gain more space. So Magnus now has 3 pawns already on the 4th rank, so on the center of the board, while as you can see, black has not crossed the 6th rank yet, so he is a lot more passive in his pawn formation, while Magnus is taking space and kicking the knight back. So now the knight goes to e6, already the 3rd consecutive knight move. Magnus played rook c1. Again, this move makes a lot of sense. The rook was not attacked, but look at this bishop. The bishop was looking down at the rook on a1, and so there might always be some danger, because this is what we call a pin. So by playing the rook to c1, Magnus steps out of the pin, and he also supports his pawn. He puts his rook behind his c pawn, which might eventually support a pawn break in the center. So now black makes yet another knight move. So this is the 4th knight move that black has made. If we remember, the knight started here from f6, and now, to be fair to black, the knight has found a very nice central square. It is supported by the other knight and by the bishop from g7, but it took him a long time to get from f6 to d4. And in fact, in chess, I don't know if you guys know this, but when the knight moves in diagonal, for a knight to jump 2 squares diagonally is the longest. How long does it take? It seems like those squares should be quite close to each other, but in fact it always takes at least 4 moves for a knight to jump 2 squares diagonally, and that is exactly what we saw. We saw the knight jump from, we saw the knight jump from f6 to d7, from d7 to c5, from c5 to e6, and eventually to d4. So it took the knights 4 moves to get to what is a nice position. Okay, so now he is in a nice spot, and white cannot kick out this knight with any pawns, because his pawns are already advanced on c4 and on e4. So instead of kicking the knight out, Magnus now decides to swap the knights, so he takes on d4, black recaptures with the knight, which makes a lot of sense. The knight is nicely placed in the center, and since Magnus, I just said, he cannot kick this knight out with the pawns, but you don't want to leave this knight on the central square. The knight is very annoying, because the knight, the more central it is, the more squares it controls. Of course, some of the squares are covered, but let me just show you what I mean. So what I mean, nope, let me see. So what I mean is, from the central square, the knight has control. I think they call this the octopus knight, if I'm not mistaken, because it can just jump to so many squares. So in general, you don't want to tolerate. If you can kick the knight out when it's so nice and central, then you do it, and that's what Magnus does. He goes bishop e3, attacking this knight. Suddenly the knight the knight before this move was not attacked at all, and suddenly it is attacked twice, once by the bishop and once by the queen on d1. So black gives up the knight and takes the bishop on e2. Magnus recaptures with the queen, and now black said, okay, I've had enough. The spider, maybe it's the spider, yeah, that's a good point. Spider or octopus, correct me if I'm wrong. I thought that octopus was also a term, but maybe the octopus is a bishop. But yeah, let's think of it as the spider knight. So white recaptures with the queen, and now black says, I've had enough with playing only on the first 3 ranks here, and he tries to grab some space with a5 and attacking Magnus's queenside pawn. So Magnus says, I'm not interested in opening your rooks, because if Magnus said, okay, I will take you, what would happen? What would happen is black would recapture with the rook, and suddenly he would have a very nice rook here, which would have an open file looking down at the pawn on a2, and potentially he could even do what we call a rook swing. So potentially the rook could come all the way over to h5 and maybe help some attack against the white king. So this is not what you want to do. You don't want to help black to activate his rook. Also, another thing that would happen if you took on a5 is suddenly your beautiful pawn structure here. What did we learn just earlier? Once again, we would have 2 isolated pawns. A pawn on a2, which cannot defend it by any other pawn, and a pawn on c4 is also isolated. So those are the reasons that Magnus did not take on a5. Instead, Magnus pushed his pawn to b5 and said, I want to keep the position closed on the queen side. So yes, there's still some debate. Is it the spider knight or the octopus? But I think I'll stick with spider for now. I think you might be right. So after b5, keeping the position nicely closed, black now makes a very interesting decision. Black decides to take this knight on c3, which in my opinion was a very dangerous decision. So why do I say that this is a risky decision by black? Why do you usually want to check twice before taking this knight here? Absolutely. So I already see one correct answer in the chat, and I think it's the main point. Because after white recaptures, suddenly you notice black has lost his dark squared bishops, and those squares around the king suddenly look quite weak, especially since white still has his own dark squared bishops. So that is the main reason. Also, the bishop on g7 was the main defender of the king. So not only do you weaken your dark squares, but you also lose your main defender. Let me just address a question in the chat. So Percy wants to know, was c5 not possible? Let me. Do you mean in this position? I guess you mean in this position. So c5 here. c5. Oh, let me check. I'm not sure if you meant here, because here there's a couple of issues. First of all, the pawn here on c5 is attacked 2 times. Once, can I not make, so okay. Once by the pawn from b4 and once by the bishop. So here I could just, I could take you. And it's not so easy for white to win the pawn back. Maybe he meant instead of knight e2. So let's go back here. So yeah, okay, here c5 absolutely, here c5 was an option. But one of the problems, I would say, behind the move of c5, I understand what you're trying to do, and it is a move that is okay. You're trying to keep this knight. I was talking about how nice the knight is on d4, so you're trying to fortify it. But I would say it's a bit, one of the problems behind playing a move like c5 is that it's a very committal move. As we all know, pawns cannot go back, and suddenly we see this square here on d5, you will never be able to contest this square anymore. So I think in the future white will probably put either a knight there, and it will be a nice outpost. Another problem is that by playing c5, the pawn on d6 becomes what we call a backward pawn. So because the pawn lost the support of the c pawn, it will be very hard to ever push this pawn, the d pawn, to d5, and that means that that this pawn on d6 will always be a long-term weakness. But it is c5 was fine and absolutely an option. I think I prefer what white did, to not be left with this weakness on d6. But a very valid and good question. Okay, so let's move on. So we go back to the game where we saw after a5, Magnus kept the position closed with b5, and we had just talked about giving up this bishop, which I would in general say try to keep that bishop. Only give it up if you have to, or if there is a very valid reason why you want to give up this bishop. Sometimes the reason can be you can win material, or as we saw earlier, you can double the pawns of your opponent. But here I don't really see a reason for black to part with what is one of his best pieces. But he decided to take on c3, Magnus recaptures, and black plays f6. So black is already trying to not limit the damage, but to make his king safer. He's first of all closing this diagonal, because if you ever put this bishop here, oops, I didn't mean to do that. Well, you could still consider it, but that bishop would have been very strong on this diagonal. So it's black is preemptively dealing with this threat, and also just trying to limit the scope of this bishop on e3. White now responds with c5. So actually one of the reasons f6, it did help with defending a little bit, but now we see another problem behind f6, because white answers with c5. And I really like this move that Magnus played. So can you guys tell me what are the ideas behind playing the pawn to c5? There's at least a couple of ideas. So there's a few, to help you answer the question, there's a few elements here that you can look at. Where are the black pieces placed? Also, how is the center looking? So what are some of the reasons you can see? And I see Max in the Chess24 chat is saying Queen c4, so I like that. Absolutely, that is one of the reasons, because as you can see, the queen could now look down here at c4, where it would be giving a check. It might also be looking down at the c pawn. So absolutely, Queen c4 is one of the ideas, because this king has weakened itself with this f6 move. Before, when the pawn was on f7, this was not the case, because this pawn was blocking the check. But after f6, you weaken the king. You're trying to protect it in some way. He tried to cover the dark squares, but then by playing that, he weakened the light squares. And absolutely, one of the ideas behind c5 is that the queen will be able to join the game and maybe make use of the king, the black weak king. The second problem, absolutely, John, the second reason that you want to play c5 is to open the center. So opening the center, because white is better developed. White has developed all his pieces, while black is still stuck with those two pieces. The bishop on c8 and the rook on a8 still have not moved. The queen is still on its starting square of d8, while white will find it very easy. White just needs one move to put his rook to d1, a nice central file. So those are all the reasons why I really like this c5 move, and well done to all of you for getting all the answers. So c5, black does not really have much of a choice but to take. He still cannot really push d5, so he takes the pawn on c5, and white now plays what we call a Zwischenzug. Once again, a Zwischenzug is quite an advanced concept. A Zwischenzug is a German word. It means an intermediate move. White could of course just recapture the pawn. He even has two ways of taking the pawn, with the bishop or with the rook, but white throws in the move rook d1 because he's gaining a tempo. By, whoopsie daisy, by attacking the black queen on d8. And the problem for black is that the queen could defend this pawn, but this pawn is already attacked 2 times anyway. So white plays this nice move, developing the final piece, and look at how nicely all his pieces are placed. The rook now has an open d file, this rook is on the c file, it's also on the 3rd rank. This black bishop has a lot of potential. Archodipto had mentioned of absolutely another idea, and we will see it in the game very, very shortly. Another idea was that this bishop can go to h6, and in fact, black put his queen to e8, and Magnus still says, I will still not take your pawn. He throws in another intermediate move, and it is the move that Archodipto had suggested in the chat just a second ago, bishop h6. So bishop h6, and once again Magnus says, I have time, I can take your pawn when I want to. For now I will attack your rook on f8, and the rook only has 1 square, and that is to go to f7. Now I think we see now a first mistake, a first and a rare mistake by Magnus, because Magnus now played queen to c4. So can somebody tell me why I say that this is a small mistake by Magnus? He has played, you know, on a couple of moves in a row. First here he could take back this pawn instead of playing rook d1. Then on the next move he played bishop h6 when he could have taken that pawn. And now he says once again, I will not take your pawn, and he plays queen to c4. So Percy is suggesting bishop e6. Actually, that's one of the moves that I like, absolutely. Black could have played bishop e6 and hitting this queen and closing this diagonal. And here I think Magnus would now finally pick up the pawn. But okay, this position, at least black has developed, and this position is not clear at all. Probably this position is around equal. So b6, absolutely a good move, a good developing move, hitting the queen. What other option did we have here as black? And I see that Alex in the Chess24 chat is saying the pawn on c7. Yeah, so that's another thing. I think if black continued with bishop e6 and queen c5, it's very likely that a lot of the game would then revolve around this weakness on c7. So very well spotted. So what else apart from bishop e6 could black have done here? Absolutely! So Percy, Crow and John all spotting the move. That is actually true. After bishop a, I forgot to make that point. I'm glad you're here to correct me. Matt, after bishop e6, of course another point which I didn't mention, and I should have, absolutely, the a2 pawn is hanging, and black would go up. Actually, black would go up a pawn here because white cannot take on c7 since that is defended by the rook. So here the position would be very unclear. Black is up, black would be up a pawn, but white would have some counterplay and compensation. The black king is a lot weaker, of course, than the white king, but this would be a game. I mean, suddenly black is also getting quite active. He's also looking at the pawn on e4, and here a very interesting game would ensue. So even better spotted. I completely forgot about our little pawn on a2, but of course that means bishop e6 is even stronger. But the other move that I was looking for, and it's been spotted by a few people in the chat, so well done to everyone, is the simple move b6. And Black just says, thank you very much. You had the chance 3 times to take my pawn. You did not take it, so now I will hold on to it and defend it with my b pawn. And suddenly it's not easy at all here for white to make progress. Also, this bishop could now still be developed to e6, but it has an extra option of potentially developing to b7 as well, and put pressure along this long diagonal from a8 to h1. And here, in fact, I looked at this position before the lesson, and Black would be doing very well here. Black would be better with his extra pawn, and it's not easy for white to find counterplay. So that's one of the dangers. I think, Magnus was already a very strong player at his young age. For those of you, if you joined us late, we are looking at a game that Magnus Carlsen played back in 2003 in the World Youth Under 14 Championship against Andre Diamant from Brazil, who also went on to become a grandmaster. But at the time the game was played, Magnus was already rated 2450, 2,450 rating points. A very impressive rating considering he was only 12 years old, while his opponent was rated 2,150. So 300 points between the two players. And I think one of the dangers in chess is that sometimes if you're playing against stronger opponent, you might trust them too much. You're playing against Magnus and you think, oh, Magnus surely must have an idea when he played Queen c4. Maybe I shouldn't be... But sometimes you shouldn't trust your opponents, and b6 absolutely should have been played. Instead, his opponent responded with c6. So Andre is trying to break the white structure here on b5. And once again, white says, I don't take your pawn. He could have, once again, Magnus could have captured, he could have captured this pawn, or he could have captured this pawn. Both moves are absolutely good moves and fine moves, but instead Magnus said, okay, I haven't taken your pawns so far and I will still not take them. Instead he activates the rook. So the rook now enters the black camp, and suddenly you can see we have 2 pieces inside the enemy camp. The rook on d6 is looking at some point, maybe at this f6 pawn. It's also looking at the c6 pawn. And because it is on a dark square, it's very hard to kick out, because Black, once again, Black wishes, I'm sure Black here wished he had not given up this bishop from g7, which would be very useful to chase the rook from d6. Black now finally develops his final piece and puts the bishop to d7. We're on move 22, so it was about time. The bishop comes out, and that means that also the rook and the queen are now connected. Magnus is still not taking any of those pawns. Instead he goes a4. And once again here, what did Black miss? I have to say a4, I don't know. I have even wondered if there was maybe a mistake in the game, but I don't assume there was. So here a4, I would say a4 and queen c4 were the 2 only mistakes by Magnus in this game. Why do I say that a4 I think is a mistake? And absolutely, John is pointing out something else. When the rook went to d6, of course, one of the threats, and that threat is still in the air. In fact, I wonder... Okay, let's answer this question first. So what should Black have played here? We always have to do some basic counting. A lot of pawns for a few moves have been hanging around this area of the board. So what should black do here? Is there maybe a pawn that is attacked more times than it is defended? The answer is yes, there is, and that is the pawn on b5. If we count, the pawn is attacked 1 time by the pawn, 2 times by the bishop behind it, and 3 times by the queen. How many times is the pawn defended? 1 time by the pawn on a4 and once by the queen. So the pawn is attacked 3 times but only defended twice, and absolutely that means that black could have just taken the pawn on b5. White has nothing better to do than to recapture, and black could just have picked up this pawn with the bishop, and once again black would be a pawn up here. Yes, white could take on c5, but black would be a pawn up, and in fact he could even take this pawn on e4 and go 2 pawns up, and suddenly if we look at the position now, it has completely turned around. Before, white was the one with the attacking chances. You might think, oh, this bishop here is hanging on b5, but why can we not take this bishop? And this is an advanced question. So why could white not pick up the bishop on b5 here? So queen e1, I'm reading a suggestion in the chat. That was also queen e1. You might think that it's checkmate. In fact, it is not checkmate because the queen from b5 can drop back. But what you do now, there is no checkmate, but well spotted, the rook is hanging. And so at the end of this long and crazy line, if we count the material now, black is up what we call an exchange. So both sides have a queen, both sides have a rook, but black has 1 extra rook where white only has a bishop. That's called an exchange. So black is up an exchange and 2 pawns, which is more than enough. Black is completely winning here. So after queen e4, that is why white could not capture the bishop. But if he cannot capture the bishop, it means he's just 2 pawns down and his attack is not as strong as it used to be. And so black would be doing very, very well here. Okay, so let's go back to the game where once again, I think that Andre was probably a little bit scared here. Because you are playing Magnus Carlsen. Magnus was one of the strongest players in his category. This was the under 14 boys World Youth Championship. Maybe he saw some ghosts. Maybe he saw, you know, this queen is looking down at your king. And there was one thing that was mentioned earlier that I should once again, I forgot to mention. I said the rook is coming to c6 and it's looking at these pawns. In fact, that was an immediate threat to take on f6 because the black rook could not recapture because of what we call the pin. The queen is pinning the rook to the king, and that actually brings us to why in the game after a4 black didn't take on b5. We just said he should have taken on b5, but instead he played king h8. And of course what king h8 does, the king is stepping out of this pin. This pin is very scary. So black said, I do not want to take your pawn on b5 because I think he was probably worried about some attacking chances. So he said, okay, I will not take your pawn. I will put my king to the corner and hopefully it will be safe on h8. And now Magnus said, okay, I will just continue increasing the pressure. I will still not take your pawns. Instead, I will double my rooks on the d file. And now, of course, he is looking down at this bishop. Thankfully for black, the bishop is defended 2 times at the moment. Once by the rook and once by the queen. So there is no immediate threat. but the rooks are looking very dangerous. And in general, this is something that you want to do. You want to double your rooks, and especially on open files. If we look at this position, the d file is the only open file in the position. Can somebody tell me what is an open file in chess? Let's see, I'll have a look at the Chess24 chat. So it's a simple question, there is no tricks here, it's just a simple question. What is an open file? Absolutely. Well done if you got it. I see some correct answers in the chat. An open file is a file that has no pawns on it. I see, actually, whether pieces on it or not does not matter. It's still an open file, even if there's pieces on it, but the answer is no pawns. And if we look at the board, the D file is the only one where there are no pawns. The A file has those 2 pawns, the B file also has 2 pawns, the C file has those black pawns, the E file has the pawn on E4, and of course the F, G and H file have both pawns from both sides. So the D file is the only open file on the board, and that's why it's a very good idea to double your rooks on the open file. Black says, I will also try to bring my rook. I will try to bring my rook and help to support my pawns on the C file, which are under some pressure. And also by bringing the rook to C8, Black is hoping that he will be able to put his rook to C7 so that it can help defend the bishop and help defend the 7th rank. At the moment, Black is still up a pawn, but as we can see, White has a lot of pressure. White still has this queen is very well placed, looking down this diagonal. Even if the king has moved, it's still a very powerful piece. We have the doubled rooks on the D file. We have the bishop on H6, which might look like it's not doing very much, but it is restricting the king's movement, and the bishop on H6 is always a very, very dangerous piece. So Magnus says, okay, I have achieved, pretty much everything I could hope for. And now we see him play what we call in chess, again, a quite advanced concept. In chess, we call a move like H3 a prophylactic move. So a prophylactic move is a move which does not do anything, immediately, but it's looking forward to the future. H3 is a move. What is the main benefit? Can somebody tell me what is the main reason? In fact, there are 2 reasons, but the main reason that you would play H3 in this position or in a lot of other positions. Why would you play this move? I see some correct answers already. The chat is very fast today. Well done. Absolutely. So it's called Luft. And Luft means, it's a German word, it means air. And what you want to do is you want to give your king air to breathe. With the pawn on H2, this king is always running the danger of what? The king is running the danger of getting checkmated on the back rank. Because if we imagine, if the pawn on E4, if we imagine this pawn was not there, what would happen then? What would happen is Black would play Queen E1 and it would be checkmate. It would be what we call a back rank checkmate, because the king would have nowhere to go and White doesn't have any piece to interpose. So that would be checkmate. So H3 makes a lot of sense. And that is exactly what I'm trying to explain. I see somebody is saying there is no need to make this move now because there is no risk to the king. But it always makes sense as a prophylactic move. Of course, there were probably more direct moves and better moves in this position, but I like the move H3 because, as I said, it's a prophylactic. It's a move where you look into the future and you think, okay, if I make this move now, my position is very well. Black has no threats, so I will never get checkmated on the back rank in the future. And another point which was made, it also controls this square on G4. So at the moment, of course, this bishop would not be doing much here on g4, but even in the future, it will never be able to come here now. So we achieved two things. The main one is to create some space for our king to make sure we don't get checkmated, and we also potentially take away this g4 square. Black now continues defending the bishop. He tries to, because once now he defends the bishop with the rook, maybe the queen could move. The queen was tied down to the defense of the bishop on d7. So now that the bishop is defended by both rooks, black could dream of maybe activating this queen, which is not doing much, on e8. But white says, no, no, no. You could have taken this pawn on b5 for such a long time. You didn't take it. Now I will use my little pawn to push it to b6. There is a question in the chat. Could we take on c6? We could. And this would be fine. Black would probably recapture either with the rook or with the pawn. And this would also be very good. Would also be very good for white, but I think the move that Magnus played is even stronger. Both moves are, there is absolutely nothing wrong with taking on c6. At this stage the position is already winning for white, or at least very close to winning, but I really like this move b6 because you're taking away any counterplay, you're taking away any chances from black. Black, the rook is attacked, it only has one square, the rook has to be go back to c8, and look at the poor black position. All the pieces are crammed, they don't have space, this pawn on b6 is very strong, and black is being completely squeezed here. So I really like this move from white, which is killing any chances of counterplay for black, because once again now this bishop is only defended 2 times by the rook on f7 and by the queen on e8, which means that black once again has to give up his dreams to activate the queen. And okay, now we come to the final stages of this game where things get a little bit more advanced still, and there is, in this position, there is what we call a tactical shot. So now Magnus found a way to end the game in a very nice fashion, and there is a move here that white played, a boom move, we might call that, a boom move. Can somebody guess what did white play here? Yes, I see there is the correct answer already in the chat. Well done. I'll give a few more seconds, but a few people have guessed it already, so well done to all of you. Indeed, Magnus sacrifices his queen now and takes the rook on f7, and that is a boom move. Boom, queen f7. So black has to recapture the queen. What else to do? So queen takes, and now black takes the bishop on d7. So even if we stop here, so Magnus sacrificed his queen, but in return he got a rook and a bishop. So can somebody tell me, I guess most of you watching will know, but some might not. So how many points are those pieces worth? The queen, the rook, and the bishop. Who can tell me first how many points these pieces are worth? Absolutely. So the queen is the most powerful piece on the board. It is worth 9 points. The rook is the second strongest. It is worth 5. And the bishop is worth 3 points. So even at this stage, white sacrificed the queen, but he got already a rook and a bishop for the queen. So that means he already has 8 points versus 9. And the queen is being attacked on f7, but not just the queen. White is hitting 2 points. He's hitting the queen and this bishop on b7. So the queen drops back to g8. White just picks up another pawn. He is not in a rush, and he is now threatening. We talked earlier about the doubling on the d file, but what other kind of doubling is there in chess? So there's the doubling on the files, but the other doubling, of course, is the doubling on the ranks. And one of the strongest types of doubling the rooks there is doubling the rooks on the 7th rank. If you can achieve this in chess, most of the time you will be very happy, because look at how powerful these rooks will be if they get to double on the 7th rank. One question is, you might ask me, well, why did black not do anything about that? Why did black not try to fight for the d file himself? So who can tell me what was wrong with the move rook d8? Absolutely, very quickly spotted. So in chess you are very often told, look at the checks, look at the captures and the threats. But here the first step is enough. Look at the checks in this position, and in fact there is only 2 checks in this position. One of them does not make much sense. It is rook h6, rook h7, but the other one is already the correct answer, and it is bishop g7. And this is a very forcing line, because in this position there is only one legal move. The king is in check. Queen g7 is the only legal move. Now we pick up this rook. Again, the king is in a lot of trouble. Black can only interpose the queen. And now we just pick up the queen, and mate will follow in just a few moves. All white has to do is move the rook out of the way and push this pawn, and black is helpless. There is nothing black can do here. So that is the reason why black could not play rook d8. Very well done if you spotted bishop g7, a nice little tactic. So instead black, he is desperate at this stage. There is already nothing black can do. He tried to play g5, trying to maybe trap this bishop. If white is a bit too slow, you might hope to survive with queen g6. I guess this was the idea. But Magnus says, no, I will not give you time to do anything. Now Magnus plays rook c7. Of course, the other move we talked about was at least as good, maybe even strong. They're both completely winning, but rook d7 was also a perfectly good move. Look at these beautiful rooks on the 7th rank. This would also be game over in just a few moves. Magnus goes for rook c7, which is also good. One element we haven't talked about, or we just talked about briefly, is this passed pawn on b6. Another monster. White has just his position. All his pieces are taking part in the attack, and black is helpless. Black tries to activate the queen, still defending the rook. I'll ask a question. What is the reason why could black not capture the rook? Is there any way, so somebody is asking, is there any way that black can defend this? No, I'll go back in a second. Basically, once Magnus sacrificed his queen against the rook, the game was over. There was no defense for black at any point. So the reason that you could not take here is because white would just recapture, and now black is helpless. This pawn on c7, a very advanced passed pawn, is covering this d8 square, and black will not be able to do anything about the rook coming to d8. And not only will you lose your queen, but this pawn will also become a queen, and checkmate will follow in just a few moves. There was a question in the chat, what if black went rook b8 here instead of queen e6? So that makes sense. You want to avoid the exchange of the rooks. I think here there is a few ways for white to proceed. I think our doubling of the rooks on the 7th rank is still a very good move, because the problem is, okay, black might be happy now, finally he got rid of our passed pawn, but here there is once again the move bishop g7, and you have to give up your queen. It's the only move. And look at this position. I'm actually very happy that we saw this line, because you remember the move that Magnus played, h3. Some of you were saying, oh, but there is no need for h3, there is no threats. If it wasn't for h3, if the pawn was still on h2, we would be checkmated on the back rank. And so you see the power of moves like h3. It looked like it was not doing much at the time, but now you're very, very happy that the pawn is on h3, and therefore the king has the space to advance to. Also, so if you don't take after rook b8, so rook d7 is one option. The other one, very well spotted in the chat by Arcodipto, is b7. You can also just say, I will not give you this pawn, I will push it to b7, and black is simply helpless. Black has no moves, all his pieces are paralyzed, and the rook will still come to d7. So both these moves are very good, either doubling immediately or saying, I will keep my pawn. So in this position, black, as we saw, played queen e6, defending the rook, trying to activate, desperately trying to activate his queen, also making a square for the king, liberating a square for the king on g8. And finally, we see this move that we have been talking about for such a long time. Finally, Magnus plays rook to d7 and doubling the rook on the 7th rank. So he showed us all the rook doublings. First, Magnus doubled his rooks on the d file, and now on the 7th rank. And there is a big threat here of taking the pawn on h7. Mate is not far. So basically the threat is to take here. Once the king goes to g8, let me show you the variation. Let's say black makes a move like c4, which doesn't do... Oh, well, sorry. My apologies. I was seeing the longer checkmate, but of course it is just checkmate right here. The black can interpose the queen, and this is actually this is a nice little checkmate here. Who can spot? There's a lot of ways to win the game, but there's only one checkmate in one move. Who can tell me what the checkmate is here? Absolutely, well spotted. Bishop g7. And it's a nice smothered kind of mate. The king on h8 cannot do anything. You cannot capture the bishop because you are pinned, and the king has no squares to go to. So a nice little checkmate here. I had seen the more complicated line. I thought there was a checkmate here. You can take here. You can give a check. And then you do the stairs, the back rank checkmate. Black can still interpose the queen. But this is checkmate, so I need to work on my tactics as well. There was the easier way, of course, of just taking the rook. So rook d7 does a few things. It attacks the rook on c8, it attacks the pawn on h7. So black is helpless, but he tried to at least get rid of the rooks. And now, who can tell me? How did the game finish here? How did the game finish here? This is your last question of the day. Absolutely, well spotted, Angami. The move you don't recapture, the rook you could recapture, but even stronger is the move that Magnus played, rook d8. It looks like it might be checkmate because the king has nowhere to go, but you can still play queen g8, and it's not quite checkmate yet, but white just takes the rook and takes this rook, and on the next move this pawn will queen and decide the game. So indeed, after rook d8, Andre Diamant resigned the game, And that was a very nice game. I think Magnus showed us, you know, that from a young age, for those of you, if you just joined us later during the lesson, Magnus was only 12 years old when he played this game in the World's Youth Under 14 Championship against another future Grandmaster, Andre Diamant. And I hope you liked the game. I hope you were able, especially if you were part, you know, of the World Online School Chess Tournament, which is running at the moment. Remember, when Magnus played this game, he was the same age, roughly, as you. He was only 12 years old, almost 13. And I think we can learn a lot from how he played this game. First of all, in the opening, all the basic ideas about controlling the center, developing the pieces, taking space, putting your king into safety. And then I think later on in the middle game, some more advanced principles of opening the center, you know, getting the initiative, finding the best squares for your pieces. And then one of the things I have to say, I hope that you all take away something. It's a small little move, and it was probably not even the best move in the position, but h3, this is such an important thing to know, to create space for your king, because as we saw at that moment when Magnus played h3, it was not doing much, but a few moves, you know, 10 moves later or 5 moves later, he was very happy to not have to worry about his weak back rank and to have this space for the king. And from there on, I mean, I'll show once again just this nice queen sacrifice by Magnus. And yeah, I think all round a very nice game. Even I hope I learned something from it. I hope you did too. I hope you enjoyed this lesson and you learned something from Magnus. Thank you so very much for watching me today. We will be back with more lessons very soon. And yes, thank you very much for watching. See you another time. Bye bye.